Konrad Laimer to Bayern Munich. I guess he's a free agent in the summer. He can sign a pre-contract January 1st, right? And this story has kind of gotten cold and hot and cold and hot again. And I think with this, I guess we'll find out really soon if Bayern Munich is still going to go all in on him for him. I think the problematic part about Konrad Laimer potentially going to Bayern Munich, what is it going to do to all these guys that are already there? Whether it be Ryan Gravenberch, who, because of going to Bayern Munich, essentially missed out on the World Cup squad, right? Marcel Sabitzer, his Austrian national team colleague, who's, I find, has somewhat resurrected his career at Bayern Munich. But if Konrad Laimer comes in, is there still space for Marcel Sabitzer? Is there still space for Ryan Gravenberch? Like, there's essentially only two positions, and Leon Goretzka and Kimmich, when they're fit, they hold that central midfield, right? So where would you even play him?
It's a really odd one, actually. So there's a big story in Sport Bild this week saying that he was offered the chance to move to Chelsea. Chelsea reached out to Leipzig and tried to sign him, and he turned them down, and he was simply said, look, I'm moving to Bayern Munich in the summer. I've already made up my decision, made up my mind, rather. That's my final decision, and, that's that. Thanks, but no thanks. And as you said, it's such a weird scenario because so much has changed since, Konrad Laimer was first linked with Bayern Munich. It was almost a certainty that he was going to move to the club in the summer. One thing or another broke down. Obviously, RB Leipzig changed over head coaches as well. And it's a lot's changed on a lot of sides. So on the one hand, you can start with RB Leipzig. They've got a new head coach in Marco Rosa, and I think it's actually quite interesting that since he's come in and since he's kind of shuffled the pack with that squad, he's also kind of changed who plays in midfield for Leipzig. So you've now actually got Haidara and Schlager are actually his go-to central midfielders there. So you can actually almost see Leipzig moving on from Laimer. They've already accepted that he's going to move. Maybe Bayern cough up a couple of £1 million or euros to sign him in January. Doesn't seem like the end of the world for Leipzig in terms of how their formation works. So that's already one thing that's changed since the summer, because last season Laimer was a really key player for RB Leipzig. But then you kind of turn to the Bayern Munich situation, and since that story was kind of at its peak, they've obviously signed Marcel Sabitzer, not signed him, sorry. He's came into that team and really kind of established himself, not as a starter or, as a first team player, but he's gone through a full season at the club where he didn't look fit, didn't look in form. He's kind of managed to turn that around now. He's kind of, you can see he's a lot more settled, and he's far more useful to Nagelsmann from week to week as a central midfielder. And then there's Ryan Gravenberch, as you talked about there. He was signed as potentially really considered one of the kind of scoops of the summer for Bayern across European football, that they were able to get this guy for such little money. There was so much back and forth, if you can remember the transfer saga about signing him. Ajax wanted more money, blah, 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 blah. They finally get their man, and he has just been this kind of forgotten soul at Bayern Munich, to the extent that I'm now wondering if Bayern are still desperate to sign Laimer. Can you foresee a situation where they sign Laimer thinking, let's just sell Gravenberch in the summer?
I mean, I just wonder what they're going to do with all these midfielders. I mean, I'm pausing because I'm actually wondering what they're going to do with Gravenberch, right? I think we have to remember too that Ryan Gravenberch is just 19, and I think he's 20 now, right? But at the time of signing, he was only 19. And he's playing, or supposed to play, in a central role for Bayern Munich, in a position that is, as I said earlier in the show, heavily occupied by Joshua Kimmich and Leon Goretzka. And Kimmich is the face of this team, right? And he's not going to give up that position willingly or freely. And so you come in, you're this young player from the Netherlands, highly promising, of course. You have all the expectations in the world on you. And then you don't play as much as you maybe expected, or maybe it was promised to you. I don't know what the discussions were when the transfer was done, right? I know that Hasan Salihamidzic and Nepe, his assistant, are quite keen on presenting players like a PowerPoint presentations where they map out their development plan. And I think that it would be curious to see what was offered and promised during these presentations. But I think that, him ultimately missing out on the World Cup squad will give him some thoughts on his future. And he's essentially, I think, has like half a year to make the squad. As for Laimer, I mean, I think I can see Laimer being in the same situation than Sabitzer was doing his first year, or Gravenberch is now. And even in a worse situation, because where are you going to put him? Stefan, I'm actually kind of surprised that they're chasing this, because Lucas Hernandez came out, now we're down with a major injury, right? And you almost wonder if Bayern Munich, knowing their abundance in midfield, are going to look at that left back position or even center back position and say, well, Benjamin Pavard wants out, Lucas Hernandez has an ACL and is probably out for the rest of the season. I almost wonder if they, unless Konrad Laimer can play center back or left back, I don't think they're going to go for that this winter. I could see them maybe do a depth signing in defense instead.
Yeah, it does make you think that, because Salihamidzic was asked that this week, wasn't he, about January signings and whether they're going to make a replacement for Hernandez. And of course he said no. He said, we're happy to kind of just deal with it. And, he came out with the usual party line that it's very hard to find quality in January, which is understandable. But I completely agree with you. The Laimer story just baffles me, because they need strikers, they need defenders, maybe they need some fullbacks. Maybe they need a goalkeeper, but central midfield is a position that Bayern Munich really don't have to worry about unless they have plans to sell Gravenberch or Sabitzer, which, as things look unlikely. I just feel like Sabitzer is Nagelsmann's man. He's a guy. He's just like a very handy player for him to have. I'd be very surprised if he was happy to let him move on. And then, unless there's something specifically wrong with Gravenberch, in which case, maybe personality-wise he doesn't get on with the head coach, or he's not developing as well as they thought he would be, and they can move him on at some point. We saw that with Renato Sanchez, for example, in the sense that they signed a player based on promise that didn't quite work out. So Bayern sold him with kind of key fees involved, which meant they made their money back in the long run, maybe. But I'm not suggesting that's really the case per se. I'm just pointing out that all these kind of boulders would have to move before Konrad Laimer had a clear shot at picking up game time at Bayern Munich. So really odd. And I think another kind of player in that Netherlands squad is far more likely to be of use to Bayern, which is another player who was linked to them this week, wasn't it?
Yeah. Can we talk really quickly one more time about Gravenberch, because before we go to the other player that's linked to Bayern, I just want to really heavily point out that he's still 20, and it takes time for young players like that to develop. And I think, and I'm curious what you think about this before we move on to all these other great topics. The Bundesliga this year is weird that we only have really 15 games before the break, right? We're not even at the halfway point. And so, because we have a similar scenario with Mathys Tel, who hasn't played as much maybe as people thought, but I mean, we're not even halfway at the season yet, and there's still lots of games to come once the World Cup is wrapped up, and there's probably still lots of players to get hurt at the World Cup. So I almost wonder if this is just too early to judge a player like Gravenberch. What do you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I feel like there's a lot of fanfare about him arriving at the club, and I am suspicious as to why he just hasn't been getting any game time. I mean, Mathys Tel has at least been getting on when Choupo-Moting's rested or in lesser games, so he is at least getting starts, and he's actually showing what he can do. Gravenberch just hasn't had an opportunity to do that at all, which is a little suspicious. But as you said, there's no real need for him at the moment, and because of Bayern's Obviously, strength and depth in that position. I just feel quite bad for the player because, as you said a moment ago, he was a Netherlands international. He moved to Bayern specifically because if he'd moved to the Premier League, then he maybe would have got shuffled out of the pack and, not picked up enough game time. And that's ultimately what's happened at Bayern. So I can't imagine the players delighted with how things are going at Bayern Munich at the moment. And would certainly not go so far as to say that he has to kind of move to get game time. But if he's reading the papers at the moment and seeing Konrad Laimer, not specifically the player himself talking about a move to Bayern, but if that's a done deal, then he's probably on the phone to his agent thinking, if I can't get game time right now at Bayern Munich, what's going to happen when Konrad Laimer, who, by the way, is another favourite of Julian Nagelsmann's, gets into this team? Because he's already got 3 guys in front of him as things stand at the moment, and it could be 4 by the time the summer comes around.
Yeah, or earlier. It could be earlier than that if Leipzig decide to cash in.